Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome everybody to the third meeting of the 2021 Interim Joint Community Education. I will ask for all members as well as those in the audience, if you would please silence or mute your cell phones at this time. We do have an overflow room. I do see that there's still a number of seats out there in the audience, but if anyone wishes to use an overflow room, we have room 169 if that's needed. Once again, room 169 for an overflow room. We do have some members that are participating with us remotely. When the roll is called, please indicate if you are at home or in your annex office. And when you join the meeting, your microphone was automatically muted, so please remember to unmute yourself if you wish to speak. And if you have any questions or comments during the meeting, please indicate that in the meeting chat function. Mariah, if you would, please call the roll.
Senator Carroll, Senator Givens, Senator Harper Angel.
Present remotely in the district.
Thank you. Senator Higdon.
Here remotely.
Thank you. Senator Kerr. Senator Meredith.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Senator Neal.
Present in the district.
Thank you. Senator Southworth. Senator Stivers. Senator Thomas. Senator West. Senator Wilson.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Baker.
Remote from the district.
Thank you. Representative Banta.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Bojanowski.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Decker.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Donahue.
Yes, ma'am. Present.
Thank you. Representative Dossett.
Present from the 9th District.
Thank you. Representative Lewis.
Present remotely from the 14th District.
Thank you. Representative Massey.
Present.
Thank you. Representative McCoy.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Miller.
Here in the room.
Thank you. Representative Gibbons Prunty.
Present remotely from the 15th District.
Thank you. Representative Rayburn. Representative Riley. Thank you. Representative Scott. Representative Timoney.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Tipton. Thank you. Representative Weber.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative White.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Wilner.
Present in the 35th House District.
Thank you. Co-Chair Huff.
Joining you remotely from outside of my district.
Thank you. Chair Wise.
Present in the room.
Thank you.
I want to thank all members present today, either remotely or in person. Also want to recognize my co-chair, who is not with us in the room, but assisting us remotely, Co-Chair Huff. Thank you so much also for being present as well. Is there any members that have any introductions before we get started this morning?
I do.
Representative, please.
Thank you,
You're welcome.
Chairman. My sister is with us today, Lisa Henson Faulkner, and her husband, Todd, visiting from Virginia.
Wonderful. Thank you from the Commonwealth to this Commonwealth. Thank you for visiting this morning. Anyone else, any other introductions? Perfect. Seeing none, we do have the minutes. We do have a quorum, so I do need a motion to accept the July 6 minutes as presented in your packets. We have a motion by Senator Meredith. I saw a second from Senator Wilson. All those in favor of accepting the minutes, please do so by saying aye.
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 Motion carries. Thank you all. We have a robust agenda for today, and today's topic is on curriculum authority and decision making. I thought this was a very timely time for us to come together and have a discussion about curriculum authority and the decision making process, and especially as it relates to public engagement, as it relates to authority in the decision-making process. And the first presenter that we're going to have is going to be presenting with us remotely. It's Mr. Ian Rowe. And I know members have a bio in their folders, but I'd like to go over real briefly Mr. Rowe's background as we contemplate any legislative implications for the 2022 legislative session forthcoming ahead of us. But Mr. Rowe is a product of the New York City public school system. He attended Brooklyn Technical High School, received his bachelor's in computer science engineering from Cornell University, and an MBA from Harvard Business School. He has held numerous fellowships, including the Echoing Green, Fahara, and Harvard Social Enterprise. He's the former CEO of Public Prep, which is the nation's first and oldest nonprofit network that exclusively develops tuition-free pre-K, elementary, and middle public charter schools, as well as educating more than 2,000 students in New York City. Presently, Mr. Rowe is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on upward mobility, education, strong families, and entrepreneurship. He is a senior visiting fellow for the Woodson Center and will continue to write for the 1776 Unites campaign. He is also writing a forthcoming book, tentatively entitled Agency, that seeks to inspire young people of all races to build strong families and become mentors of their own destiny despite life's challenges. And we would at this time like to welcome Mr. Ian Rowe, who is joining us remotely. Mr. Rowe, do we have you there?
Yes, you do.
Perfect. If you would, just introduce yourself from the record, please, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator Wise. And yes, my name is Ian Rowe. Thank you to all of the distinguished members of the Interim Joint Committee on Education. Thank you for that introduction. I do come to you from the American Enterprise Institute, as well as the 1776 Unites Coalition, which some folks may know is a Black-led, nonpartisan, and intellectually diverse alliance of individuals crafting solutions to some of our country's greatest challenges in education, family, culture, and upward mobility. It was launched in February of 2020 by civil rights movement veteran Robert Woodson, and a number of leaders who celebrate Black excellence, reject victimhood culture, and showcase the millions of Americans who've prospered by embracing the founding ideals of America. But I do come to you primarily as an educator, and as you described, Senator Wise, a product of New York City public schools. I had a great public education. I'm now founding a new network of international baccalaureate high schools, which will open in the Bronx. And as Senator Wise says, for the last 10 years, I was CEO of a nonprofit network of public charter elementary and middle schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. You know, our faculty had an incredible responsibility to educate more than 2,000 students, primarily low-income Black and Hispanic kids, whose parents entered the lottery and chose our schools because they wanted their kids to have a shot at the American dream. We had nearly 5,000 families on our wait list, you know, all just desperate for their kids to receive a high-quality education. And similar to parents throughout Kentucky, many of our families in low-income communities, you know, they may have faced racial discrimination and other challenges in their own lives and thought that their kids might as well. But they knew that a great education could make a huge difference. They knew that their children might face closed doors because of America's legacy of slavery, but they also knew that because of America's legacy of Black excellence and resilience in the face of slavery and discrimination, hundreds of doors are now open. And young people of all races have the ability to open their own doors if they're prepared to capitalize on the opportunities at their fingertips. So with that in mind, you know, in preparing for this testimony, and I'd ask please to pull up that first chart that I shared. In preparing for this testimony, I looked at 8th grade reading proficiency scores on what's called, if you can pull up the other chart first. Perfect, that one. So there's something called the National Assessment for Educational Progress. It's often referred to as the nation's report card, or NAEP. It's It's a national assessment that's given every 2 years at 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade in reading and math. And I decided to look at Kentucky's performance on this national assessment versus just Kentucky state exams, primarily because NAEP is a national study. It's consistent from year to year. You can really look at longitudinal comparisons over time. And as you look at this chart, which breaks it up just by 3 races, as you'll see, as is the case with many other states, in each year since the nation's report card was administered, in Kentucky in 1998, less than 40% of Kentucky's white students in 8th grade scored NAEP proficient in reading. And as the chart indicates, the racial achievement gap, when you look at Black and Hispanic kids, has essentially remained the same for two decades. And why that's interesting is that for the last 30, 40 years, if you're in the world of education reform, if you read the mission statement of virtually any ed reform organization, you'll find language around closing primarily racial achievement gaps or class achievement gaps. Unfortunately, that multi-decade obsession with closing achievement gaps has failed to close those achievement gaps. And more importantly, that approach also has not substantively increased overall achievement levels. The sad irony is that closing the Black or Hispanic to white achievement gap without improving outcomes for all students would mean Black and Hispanic student outcomes would simply grow from sub-mediocre in terms of reading performance to full mediocrity. And I know that that's not what any of us want to achieve. And if you can now show the next chart. So this chart takes a snap. So while that other chart was a longitudinal chart showing performance from 1998 to present day, this chart shows just raw numbers because it's important to look at student counts. So in 2009, again, looking at the same assessment of NAEP proficiency, and that's in this snapshot in 2019, nearly 27,000 white 8th grade students, 2,700 Hispanic students, and 4,800 Black students did not read at proficiency based on the 2019 NAEP exam. Now, overall, white students make up a much larger segment of the overall population, and thus that helps to explain the larger representation in these categories. But still, it's important to look at both proportional rates of success and actual student counts, because we see that these numbers of failed reading proficiency, both in raw numbers and proportional rates by group, underscore our nation's collective failure to effectively teach literacy and build verbal proficiency across all races and classes. And this is a bedrock for all learners. It essentially shatters the accepted truth that there is any sole or even primary cause of low proficiency rates among Black and Hispanic kids. For example, systemic racism is unlikely the cause of such poor performance among white students. In my view, the multi-decade obsession with closing achievement gaps by certain category has done something even worse. It's ushered in what I call a monocausal type of thinking that crowds out the ability to identify solutions across categories. So if you see a gap, you think, oh, there must be discrimination based on that gap. So if one believes systemic racism, for example, is the sole or primary cause of racial disparities, then a tendency of that conclusion is to identify a narrow universe of solutions focused on race as well. That's why you see a focus on topics like critical race theory become a huge distraction from this decades-long literacy crisis, which is core for all of our students. And since it seems that most discussions regarding critical race theory are hampered because there isn't even a common definition, I ground my thoughts in the meaning provided by two of critical race theory's intellectual architects, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk, In the foreword of their co-authored book, Critical Race Theory and Introduction, they write, quote, "Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law." You can, by the way, you can take the chart down now. We can show it if folks have questions afterwards. I, for one, am opposed to an ideology that literally, by definition, questions equality theory that encompasses equal rights, equal protection under the law, and equality of opportunity. And just overall, increasingly, American institutions are enforcing this kind of intolerant orthodoxy that requires us to view each other based on these immutable characteristics like skin color, or gender, or sexual orientation. It unnecessarily pits us against one another and diminishes what it means to be human. In many instances in education, we see faculty forced into professional development, or students in their classrooms divided by race and forced to confess their status as oppressor or oppressed. There's an alternative, more positive approach. Instead of a race or class-based gap approach, imagine if the strategy was what some call distance to 100. Distance to 100 would emphasize that the gap between 100% proficiency for all students and our current performance levels, that's the gap that should be our dominant focus. If we approach things that way, we would start to question, well, why is it that only a little more than a third of all kids across the country are reading at proficiency? That distance to 100, nearly 70%, is more than double the class and race-based achievement gaps. If we adopted this approach, we might soon quickly discover that the reason that a majority of white students have consistently not been reading at grade level has significant overlap with the reason that a majority of Black and other students have not been reading at grade level. Then we might expand our aperture. We might expand our focus on solutions to include school choice, so that every parent has access to a strong school, regardless of zip code, race, or income level. We would also work to strengthen families so that more children are born into stable and healthy two-parent households. We would ensure more teachers are trained in the science of reading instruction, especially using content-rich curriculum, which seems to be the subject of today's discussion. And one way to bring in content-rich curriculum is to teach a complete history of our country. Because one of the things that's so important that I've learned running schools for the last decade, especially in places like the South, it's important that our kids know that they live in a good, if not great country, one that's not hostile to their dreams, where they know that millions of kids of all races have embraced founding ideals around family, faith, hard work, entrepreneurship, and education to move from persecution to prosperity. It's one of the reasons the 1776 Unites group that I'm part of actually created a curriculum to actually demonstrate these incredible stories of resilience, and in this case, to tell a more complete story about the African-American experience in the United States. When we saw that the New York Times had produced the 1619 Project, which was made into a curriculum, it was advocating for things like the founding of the country wasn't even 1776, that it was 1619, that the founding ideals were false when they were written, that the country was founded as a slavocracy and not a democracy. We just thought that was wrong. And we needed to create a compelling and empowering alternative. So we created a curriculum now which features lessons on such things as the Rosenwald schools, which are an unbelievable story, but real. Booker T. Washington partnered with Julius Rosenwald, who in the early 1900s was the CEO of the Sears Roebuck Company. They partnered together to build more than 5,000 schools throughout the South to educate Black kids because of the inferior education that they were forced to undergo. An incredible story of achievement under incredible adversity. There are other lessons on figures such as Biddy Mason, a woman who was born a slave and died a millionaire. How did she do that under such extreme conditions? Elijah Mccoy, an inventor who became so famous for his products, the phrase, "I want the real McCoy," is associated with him because his products were so superior that there are all these knockoffs, but people said, "I want the real McCoy." This is just a snapshot of some of the lessons that we've created. It's a free curriculum that's now been downloaded more than 15,000 times by teachers in all 50 states. The curriculum is now being taught in public, private, parochial schools, after schools, prison ministries, homeschools, anywhere where character formation is happening with children. I offer it up as just one example of how curriculum, teaching a complete history of our country, warts and all. We can teach about the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, as well as the progress that has been made against those. But that can be part of the strategy to improve the nation's literacy crisis, which often gets diminished when we focus on things like critical race theory, which again is, in my view, is a big distraction. And let me just close before we get to questions, and just how we can think differently about these things. It may seem a little off, but I was inspired by this story. I recently saw the CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, who was explaining how he had to mobilize his team of scientists and engineers as they were thinking about a vaccine, and how could he get them to think out of the box and just think differently about solving this problem. And he said, it typically takes 10 years to develop a vaccine. And he said, if he had told his team 8 years, it would have been a major improvement. They would have said, "Oh my God, that's a stretch goal." But we didn't have 8 years. So he said, you don't have 10 years, you don't have 8 years, you have 8 months. And then he said, if you've got to develop, more dosages of vaccines, typically you do 250 in a year. Well, now you've got to do 2.5 billion. The reason he said these things was he wanted to take his team outside of the framework that they had typically used to solve problems. And I think we have an opportunity to do the same in education. For a long time, we've been focused on closing gaps. And that strategy just hasn't worked. It hasn't worked to close the gaps, nor has it worked to raise overall achievement levels. If I thought that focusing on gaps would be a solution, believe me, I've been in education long enough where I'd be strongly advocating for that strategy. We can take a different approach. As Bourla said when he quoted Aristotle, he said, "Our problem is not that we aim too high and miss. Our problem is that we aim too low and hit." My hope is that we as education leaders can come together to find productive ways, not only to teach America's full history, warts and all, but perhaps more importantly, focus on an issue that I think affects all of our kids, in particular literacy. And we prepare all of our students to aim high. Maybe this idea of distance to 100 might offer some window into how we can think differently about how we set ambitious goals for our country's future and mobilize our teachers and kids to reach them. And with that, I will step back and take questions.
Mr. Rowe, thank you for the very refreshing and intelligent discussion. Greatly appreciate all your comments and your remarks and the research that you put into today's presentation this morning. As you mentioned there about curriculum, and you mentioned a number of educators, I think you said 15,000 times that curriculum has been downloaded. Where could schools, or those of us in the audience, those that are educators and your viewing audience as well, where could schools go to find that specific type of curriculum that you're talking about that supports the 1776 Unites?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, this is a free curricula. It ultimately will go from kindergarten through 12th grade. You can go to www.1776unites.com. If you go there, you'll see some incredible offerings. As I just mentioned a few, all of it is organized around a key set of principles: resiliency, courage, because not only do we want kids to look back at largely unknown stories of American history, we also want kids to look forward. What are the behaviors? What are the character-based strengths that I should embrace as a young person as I think about my future? So there's a look back component and a look forward component that really organizes itself around these key principles. So 1776unites.com is where you can go to get that curriculum.
Thank you, sir. We do have some questions from various members of the committee. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into those. Representative Bojanowski.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rowe, for joining us today. I do want to make a clarification. Being proficient on NAEP does not mean that you're reading at grade level. And it is significantly above that. So, I mean, I'm a special education elementary school teacher, and I teach reading every day. And so I know that proficient on NAEP. Now, that doesn't mean we don't want to improve the literacy of our students. I would agree that the emphasis on closing gaps is problematic. But from my perspective, I would say that it's all driven by the federal laws requiring the high-stakes accountability testing. And if we can shift our pedagogy to, in Jefferson County today, they're having a conference called Deeper Learning. If we could shift our focus from essentially test prep, which the reality is that there are so many stakes on these assessments that every day in the building is how do we get our kids to score well on the test, and move it into a deeper learning situation where all kids can be engaged, problem solving and that type of a pedagogy. So, and I do want to say that I very much agree with you that this emphasis or crisis about critical race theory is a distraction. And I would like you to elaborate on, if you would, one thing that I would much rather be spending my time on, which I am, but I'd rather spend more of it, is how do we improve early literacy in our state? And in Jefferson County, we already have school choice, so students can pick which school they go to. There's a whole process for that. So I'd like you to maybe focus from your experience as an administrator. You mentioned science of reading. What do we have to do, and what can we do as a state to build the literacy of all of our students, especially, our most at-risk students?
Yep, excellent questions. Thank you. So I concur with you that NAEP proficiency is different than what occurs in each state. But one of the values of NAEP is that there's a consistency so that you can actually measure year to year, as opposed to states, which often change their state exams. But it sounds like we're in concurrence that a focus on literacy and improving literacy outcomes is fundamental. I mean, one of the things that I think sort of the legacy of No Child Left Behind, because I actually worked at the White House during the time when that was being developed, was that there were aspirations, simple objectives, which were all kids should be reading and doing math at grade level. It seemed like a reasonable assumption. But what has occurred over time is that the pathways to get there, so you saw a shrinking of content-rich curriculum. So if you look at just time spent during the school day, if you look 20 years ago, look at the amount of time spent on social studies and science in particular, those topics have almost just vanished. They're often relegated to maybe 2 days a week, 45 minutes a day, or 1 day. So one thing to do is to reintroduce content-rich curriculum, especially in social studies and science, in the early grades, and ensure that it's content-rich, that it's not slanted, that it doesn't have a political ideology tied to it, because that's literacy. Social studies and science is literacy. And I think in somehow the quest, as you call out, to pass exams became so obsessed with this idea of, well, what's the main idea? We started to believe that somehow the content itself didn't matter. And that, I think, has been one of the huge tragedies of the testing environment that you're calling out. So I would make a strong push for reintroducing content-rich curricula, especially social studies and science. And then in terms of how to more effectively get better early literacy outcomes, something I did when I was running the network of schools in New York, initially our schools started in kindergarten, at 5 years old, but we saw so many kids that were coming in with a host of, they didn't have a strong vocabulary exposure. So we started pre-K. We were one of the first charter schools in New York to start pre-K, and that was pretty powerful. But even at 4 years old, we saw kids still not having enough exposure. So we did something innovative. We partnered with a home visiting group that's literacy based, where for 2 years, starting at 18 months old, literally the younger siblings of our current students would have an early literacy specialist visit the home of our younger siblings, where for 2 times per week, 30 minutes per visit, the early literacy specialist would spend time with the caregiver and the toddler, reading a book, bringing a new book each week. So over the course of 2 years, they'd have a 100-book library at home. But the whole idea was not only to build the capacity of the toddler in terms of being able to increase their vocabulary, it was also to increase the capacity of the caregiver so that they become a better at-home reading coach. And we think, honestly, sometimes kindergarten, it's not that it's too late, but we've had such missed opportunities in those first years. And so if there are ways to break the firewall between kindergarten and all those years that kids may or may not be in healthy literacy environments, that's something I would also focus on.
If I may just make a statement?
Please.
I'm very appreciative for that, because I'm hoping that my colleagues will invest in early childhood, because we know that that's like the key to everything about literacy. And I thank you for sharing the program. I appreciate it.
Yeah, the one thing I'd say is that the reason I liked the home visiting partnership was that we were building the capacity of the caregiver in addition to the child at home. So it was not another center-based early childhood experience where the kid was coming in. So I do think there's a distinction there, that if there's a way to build capacity in the home with the caregiver, that I think has more enduring impact.
Next question, remotely joining us, Representative Wilner.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you especially for the focus on the importance of early childhood education and on the focus on literacy being a cross-curricular activity. As my colleague Rep. Bojanowski pointed out, we focus so much on the test scores and we lose sight of the importance of content. And the fact that math literacy in the early years is the biggest
numeracy, yeah,
predictor of literacy. So thank you for that. I was curious. You talked about all students being able to choose, or all parents being able to choose a school where their students can be successful, but you've got a huge wait list at public charter, so it's the luck of the lottery.
Yeah.
So I was curious to know, and I hate to reduce this to a funding conversation, but I would like to have an understanding of the funding mechanisms and what in the charter network the spending is per pupil, and how we would expand the success you're having there to really, truly all students
Yeah.
without, traditional public education being the
Yeah.
route for that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think like most of the country where you do have charter schools, first of all, most charter schools are publicly funded. They're organized by nonprofit organizations in most of the country. Like in New York State, you can only have nonprofit networks that support public charter schools. The public funding is similar to traditional district schools. There's a per pupil allocation. It's normally, though, let's call it 60 to 80% of what the traditional district schools are. So most charter schools do raise philanthropy to close that gap until there are enough students that you can sustain purely on public dollars. New York is, I will say, New York is one of the most significantly funded school systems in the country. So I think in New York City, I think the average district student per pupil allocation is a little bit north of $20,000. So I don't know what it is in Kentucky, but I don't think it's that high. And then charter schools get about 16.5, close to 17. But part of the goal with many of my charter school colleagues is that we want to demonstrate, look, we can take the same children. Oftentimes we're in the same buildings with traditional district schools at less money per kid and show superior results, not just on test scores, although that is one metric, but hopefully on a lot of other things, chess champions and debate champions, and obviously college graduation rates and other life outcomes to show that there can be a better way to educate our kids. So hopefully that answers your questions. But we're funded, we're publicly funded, usually 60 to 80% of the district level. We raise philanthropy to close the gap financially, but then at some point you reach a certain number of students where you can now operate perpetually on public dollars.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Chairman Wise. And let me begin by saying some preparatory remarks. First of all, Senator Wise, I want to commend you for bringing issues like this before the legislature during this interim. I didn't have a chance to mention that when we had our discussion on critical race theory in May, but I told you privately that the next time I was able to talk about this, I was going to congratulate you, because one of the things that historically we have not done in America is really address the issue of race head on. We've always kind of hid it in the closet. We don't want to talk about it. But what we've seen since last year is the willingness of Americans to deal with race head on and to bring it to the forefront. And I think that's what we have to do as a country if we're going to get ahead on this issue and really try to resolve the problems that race presents here in America. So I commend you, Senator Wise, for doing that. I really appreciate that. Secondly, to you, Representative Bojanowski, you should know that just as yesterday, President Biden announced that he wanted to appropriate and was going to recommend appropriation in the upcoming federal budget for universal early child education for 3 and 4-year-olds. I know you and I have talked about this. Senator Wise and Senator Givens knows that I've been a strong proponent of that since I arrived in the Senate. And so hopefully we will get to that point soon in this country where we have universal pre-K. Dr. Rowe, if you can bring him back on screen. Dr. Rowe.
I'd like to call myself doctor, but I'm just a mister.
Okay, what's the Rowe? Excuse me. I really wish we had more time. We don't have more time today. But I really would like to engage with you because one of the things that I appreciate about learning is having people who have different thoughts and different approaches. I will tell you respectfully that I disagree with a lot of what you said, but the learning process occurs when you engage with people who have different viewpoints and different opinions with you. And that's how you learn. Yeah. And so I really appreciate you coming forward and giving us your positions today. Okay. My question to you, now I have a question. My question to you is this. As I look at education here in this country, particularly in this state, I see achievement gaps in our urban areas where black students are underperforming like somewhere between 43 and 53% below white students. They're comparable white students. I look at disciplinary records and I see that black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended and removed from school than white students. Okay. I see these kind of disparities, and I have to ask myself why. And it seems to me the common theme there is race. Now you want to suggest that race is not a factor here in America in terms of why we have differences in outcomes, but I would respectfully disagree with that. And in terms of education, and say I think again we have to look at race as a cause of why we have these different disparities in learning, disparities in terms of disciplinary causes, and say we've got to realize that is a cause and find ways to overcome that. I'll give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. And first of all, I would love to get together because it is through dialogue and debate that we all, as people, as a country, get to better solutions. So I think a return to civil discourse, even when we disagree, is central for us to move forward. To your question, it's a tough one because, and I try to address it in my opening remarks, which is that when we see disparities, let's say disparities based on race, disparities based on class, disparities based on gender, there's often a tendency to say, well, the reason for that disparity must be because of that category grouping. Either it's sexism or racism or classism. And I think what we found is that the story is usually more complex by that. And if I gave the impression that I was saying race doesn't matter, then I apologize, because that's not the point that I'm making. The thing that I think is challenging for us is what I call this monocausal thinking, which is that we presume that if there's a disparity, then the sole or significantly dominant factor is this one thing. And that's where I think it leads us into solutions that are also all about that one thing. And I focus on literacy in particular because the data just shows, and this is why I highlight the performance of white students. I mean, in the entire country, in the entire history of the National Assessment for Educational Progress, since the report was first done in 1992, you have never had a majority of white students reading at NAEP proficiency levels. So the reason I think that that's interesting is, again, it's probably unlikely that systemic racism is driving white underperformance. So what are those factors? Because my sense is, if we really hone in on why a majority of white kids have not been reading at grade proficiency for decades, that probably has a lot of overlap with why Black and other kids aren't. And so it's not to say that race isn't an issue. It's just, in my view, it's not the sole issue. And I think there's a lot to learn. And maybe we can actually all come together to solve some of these sort of fundamental issues, particularly around literacy, that I think would shrink the gaps that we are seeing. So that's my response. And again, I really appreciate your offer sort of constructive disagreement, because that's how we have to move together as a country.
Thank you. Representative Banta.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rowe. You're phenomenal. I suspect you'll be Dr. Rowe someday soon, maybe. I just wanted to clarify something, because I heard a lot of gasps when you said $20,000 per student. Some states average in the salaries of teachers in that per pupil. And I was wondering, do you know if New York does that? Because 20,000 just struck me as really, really high. I know Indiana does it by us. They average in the teacher salaries with the per pupil.
Oh, yes.
That drive. Okay, so they do that. Okay, see, Kentucky doesn't. So when you say $20,000, you heard a collective gasp, and because we don't include our teacher salaries in that. So
right.
I mean,
whenever I share the per pupil in New York City, there's in any other state in the union, people usually gasp because we have a very high per pupil. We also have very high costs in salaries, real estate. So it's on a proportional basis, but yeah, it's we do include teacher salaries and a whole bunch of other things in there as well.
Representative Decker.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to also commend you for this discussion and for Representative Huff and that leadership. Thank you very much. Mr. Rowe, I've watched you various times on the internet debate this type of discussion and whether critical race theory is valuable. I've also read interviews that you have given, and you're often asked about your thoughts about CRT being a distraction. And I think today Representative Bojanowski mentioned that, and I don't think her interpretation of what you meant is exactly what you meant. I have read your thoughts that ideas cannot be banned from school, and I agree with that totally. I'm the primary co-sponsor on a bill in Kentucky where we are seeking to prohibit the state promotion of theories such as critical race theory and those types of ideas. Not talking about banning the ideas, but the state promotion of them. I think that what I have understood you to mean about the distraction of CRT is different than the fact that you don't think it should be discussed or whether it should be promoted by the state or whether state legislatures should even consider it. So could you expand on what you meant by it being a distraction?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity for the clarification. Yeah, so when I say distraction, if I were to rank, all the issues facing our kids in our school systems, whether or not critical race theory is being taught in K to 12 schools would fall way down the line versus the nation's literacy crisis, for example. That doesn't mean, just to your point, that it should be banned. America is based on the free expression of ideas, even the ones you don't like. And so the only thing worse than compelled speech, where kids or teachers are being told you have to declare yourself an oppressor or oppressed based on your skin color, the only thing worse than compelled speech is suppressed speech. So you can't, you can't ban critical race theory in the same way you can't ban the discussion about communism or socialism. In fact, it's much better to expose these things and talk about it. Now, I don't think you'll be debating critical race theory in first grade. So I think there's got to be more appropriate places, probably in higher ed, maybe at the high school level in a seminar. But if you're teaching critical race theory, what you can't have it become is critical race theology, where you're only teaching one topic. So if in the definition of critical race theory challenges the very ideas of equality theory and neutral principles of constitutional law, then you got to make sure that you got those principles being taught at the same time. And you have enough respect for the learner that they can hear all of these ideas, discuss and debate, and then decide for themselves. But the banning is I think, a very slippery slope. And in fact, falls into using tactics, which I think, is what, others are trying to do maybe in other ways. I think America is based on free expression of ideas. I happen to disagree with critical race theory. I think it's worthy of being discussed and debated. But banning it, suppressing it is not the right way to go. And in terms of distraction, I'd much rather we spend a lot more time thinking about literacy and how do we teach rich history, rich social studies and science, especially in the early grades, so that we give our country a more competitive stance than what we have today.
Could I follow up with?
Briefly.
Okay. So briefly, just again to try to clarify what you've said, when I have seen you speak about this in various forums, I have heard you talk about the fact that schools would focus, not legislators, but that schools would focus on critical race theory would be a distraction of things they should be doing otherwise, but that if a legislature is not banning the idea but seeking to broaden or not allow compelled speech and in our schools, that is not what you meant. That it's not a distraction to focus on whether it's being promoted. It's a distraction to let that theory be a focus as to how to stop the achievement gaps. Is that correct?
Correct, because in some places the way critical race theory is actually playing out in real classrooms, you have things like privilege walks,
yes,
where students are lined up in a horizontal line, and a teacher might say, take 3 steps forward if you're white to demonstrate your inherent privilege based on your skin color, and take 5 steps backward if you're Black to represent your inherent oppression. And those are just not things that are productive for anyone. So when actual critical race theory practices like that are implemented, that's more than just a distraction. Those could actually be violations of the Title VI provisions of the Civil Rights Act, or violations of First Amendment, where kids or teachers are forced to say things like, I'm an oppressor simply because of my race.
Thank you.
Thank you. Members, we have 3 more presentations following this. I ask you to please keep your questions direct. Next, Senator Southworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to kind of follow up because you mentioned higher ed, maybe, and then you said maybe high school, and that's actually, as far as appropriate time, I'm thinking of what's the age appropriate time to bring up these things. That's kind of what I was thinking as I was mulling over this topic over last month, since we discussed it last month. Can you give us a little more indication on what you consider to be maybe age appropriate? I'm just thinking in the range of things that our students have to learn. Certain topics we don't bring up to certain students at different ages because it's not really up to them to decide what they think about it. It's like you have to give them some structure. I mean, kids thrive in, a given structure. And then, of course, as we get older, we find out there's, more exceptions to the rules than there are the rules. But can you give us an idea about what you've experienced or seen relating specifically to the age appropriateness and how we do these things?
Well, as it relates to critical race theory, I mean, one of the challenges, I think, on this topic, and again, why it gets so much airtime, is that there are many different definitions of what critical race theory is. And I think it either becomes more, your definition either becomes more innocuous or more fearful, depending on what your position is, right? So some people say, well, critical race theory, that's just teaching history. And so therefore it's appropriate to be teaching critical race theory in elementary school. And that's why I often start with the definition that came from its crafters. Again, I'll say it again, quote, unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law, end quote. So that's a pretty sophisticated legal theory, which for me is most appropriately discussed and debated at the higher education level, which is why I don't really think it's appropriate K to 12. Unfortunately, in this debate, it's kind of a moving target with definition. So I think it's really important, if you guys move forward, nail this definition so that it can't just be, well, it's just teaching rich history. That's not what this is, because I don't think anyone disagrees, for example, that kids in elementary and middle school should have a rich exposure to American history, as long as it's not cherry-picked like the 1619 Project does, of exclusively focusing on only the negative aspects of American history, nor should it be the other extreme, which is only choosing the sanitized versions of American history. Our country is rich in its history, and it's strong enough, warts and all. So my general view as relates to critical race theory is to stay with the definition as its architects outlined. And I think most people would read this and say that's not appropriate for first grade. And don't try to have these shifting definitions apply just because you're either for or against it. Stick to the original definition, and then we can have separate discussions about what's appropriate history that should be taught in our schools at certain grade levels.
Thank you.
Mr. Rowe, we want to thank you for spending the last hour with us. Thank you for a refreshing discussion, open and honest dialogue. We respect you for your time. We know you're very busy, but once again, thank you so much for presenting with us this morning. You're welcome to the Commonwealth anytime you wish to get out of the city and come to the Bluegrass State.
I really appreciate it, and I'd love the opportunity to follow up and discuss, but I commend you all for just great questions and just being committed to the best outcomes for all of our kids. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on with our agenda this morning. The next, still dealing with curriculum, is our presentations on student assignments and public input. We have some parent constituents that are with us today, those being Benny Gahegan, I think I pronounced that correct, who is joining us, as well as Miranda Stovall. If they would make their way to the table, please, this morning. And if you would, just please introduce yourself for the record this morning with your name, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Beanie Gohagan. Thank you all so much for having me here, for allowing me to speak. Thank you for talking about this topic that is so near and dear to my heart and to the hearts of thousands of parents all over Kentucky. My stepfather graduated from the public high school where I met my husband. My 3 sons graduated from that very same high school, and I am proud to say that several of my classmates were teachers at that school at that time. I have a degree in elementary education and special education, and I've worked in the schools as an employer or a volunteer for over 20 years. I tell you all of this to let you know that I have been a supporter of public schools for a long time. I think that is why these past few years have been so heartbreaking for me. All of my kids had the privilege of being taught by the same fabulous reading teacher in 5th grade. They read 5 or 6 quality novels throughout the year, discussed and analyzed writing pieces, wrote, edited, and rewrote a variety of essays and narratives, and developed an appreciation for various types of literature. They were prepared for the challenges ahead. Unfortunately, those challenges never came. I will just take my daughter's experience to simplify things. She attended a magnet middle school where she had to apply and be accepted into the Gifted and Talented program. Her 6th grade year, she read 1 book, Tangerine by Edward Bloor. Being gifted and talented, my daughter finished the book quickly. While the rest of the class spent the next month reading it, my daughter was put in front of the computer to play games. Her 7th grade year, she read 3 chapters of The Lord of the Flies. That's it. They did not finish that book, nor did they read any others all year. I figured 8th grade would be spent preparing the students in the Gifted and Talented program to go on to the rigorous and highly competitive high school arena. I was wrong. The first day of class, they played apples to apples as an icebreaker. It is a word association game for those of you who aren't familiar with it. The reader says a word, and the team chooses the card in their stack that best matches the word. My daughter was the reader. The word was crazy. The teacher's response was Republicans. Not only did he fail to assign 1 book to the 8th grade Gifted and Talented English class all year, but he also made it very clear how he felt about certain people. Knowing what I did about the low expectations of her middle school classes, I told my daughter early on that she needed to be learning outside of the classroom if she wanted to get in and succeed at the top high school in the state. She took my advice and was accepted. She was ready for a challenge. Unfortunately, that was a disappointment as well. In English class, she received a 33-page packet of writing selections of varying quality, but with a clear ideology. This, and Animal Farm, accounted for their reading all year long. This is advanced freshman English at one of the top schools in the state. When I inquired about it, I was assured they would be reading selections from classics, but that never happened. Meanwhile, they found time to discuss internalized misogyny, the gender wage gap, the perceived oppression of certain groups in our society, and even why the teacher was removing the word freshman from her vocabulary. The teacher and I had regular, polite correspondence, and each time I questioned the curriculum, she stated she was teaching the standards. As a parent, concerned citizen, and taxpayer, I'm greatly concerned that our students are not receiving the quality education they deserve. There does not seem to be a clear standard for the curriculum materials being used, and there is very little transparency once they reach middle and high school. Our schools are spending a lot of time, money, and resources on social justice issues and current events while failing to expose students to high-quality literature and foundational skills. This is just one of my 4 children. This is just one subject. I could share the narrative for each of my children, and I could include other subjects. My point is, parents want their children educated, not indoctrinated. And as much as I appreciate an audience with you today, we should not have to go to our state legislators to ensure that it happens. In closing, I thought I would share just a few examples that other parents have shared with me from across the state to demonstrate what a widespread problem this is. In one district, several elementary schools chose to read the book entitled Something Happened in Our Town. In this story about a black man who was shot by a white police officer, the big sister tells Emma that the cops shot him because he is black, and her mother tells her that the mistake is part of a pattern, being nice to white people and mean to black people. Josh, another little boy in the story, asks if the white cop who shot the black man will go to jail. His brother says he won't go to jail because cops stick up for each other and they don't like black men. When parents expressed concerns over this book being read, nobody seemed to know who had approved the book for the classroom. In an 8th grade advanced English class, the class watched 2 videos during a particular lesson. The first video communicated to the students that the American dream isn't real, stating that hard work and perseverance don't always lead to success. The second video explored racism and stated that if a white child and a black child both take the same courses, earn the same GPA, and have the same major, the white student will get preference over the black student when applying for jobs. The teacher then had the class read aloud a handout entitled I Can't Breathe. It discussed white privilege and white supremacy. During the discussion afterward, the teacher stated that white people have more rights under the law than black people. She stated that her information was from experts. One student was keen enough to record this class, and I've listened to it for myself. First, this is advanced English class, and they should be reading quality literature and honing their writing skills. Second, where was the opposing point of view in this lesson? Third, who decided this curriculum material? Finally, I will leave you with a writing prompt from a high school English class. Systemic racism is both a theory and a fact of life. As a theory, it is based on the idea that the United States has been a racist society since it was started. Racism is part of all features of American life. Today, systemic racism is the result of racist laws, ideas, and behaviors. These give an unfair amount of resources, rights, and power to white people. Meanwhile, they deny resources, rights, and power to people of color. People of color include Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. Now that you understand what systemic racism is, what is an example of it that we talked about in our last session? This prompt is from a widely used instructional content platform. Who approved this platform? Who approved this prompt? Thank you for your time and attention on this issue today. I believe that it is imperative that future generations can read, understand, and apply the principles woven throughout our founding documents. That will not happen if we continue on this trajectory.
Ms. Keegan, thank you for being here. Thank you for your testimony this morning. Also joining us virtually is Miranda Stovall. Ms. Stovall, I'm not sure if you wish to also provide any additional comments this morning.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please identify yourself for the record and please proceed.
My name is Miranda Stovall, and I have 4 children in public education. Thank you guys so much for allowing me to speak to you today. I just wrote something up for you. What are my kids being taught in school? What are the lessons and who approves those lessons? What materials are being used? I believe these are fair questions and the answers should be easily found and readily available for any parent. Seeing some assignments from my high schooler during NTI raised these questions. He had a project titled the Race Card Project. The assignment prompted my son to dissect this picture, and the project insinuates that if he thought she was angry, It's because he's white. So this just led to more questions about curriculum. I sat down thinking I could find the answers on the schools and districts' websites. I found where I could view Sbdm minutes, and I spent several hours over a few days reading the minutes available for my children's schools. And the conclusion was the transparency of curriculum is just not there. And if curriculum is mentioned, there's nothing noting what was approved or discussed. I also, throughout my searching, found each individual school's racial equity tool or policies, sorry. And in my daughter's elementary school, it mentions project-based learning experiences embedded in social justice, and she's in 2nd grade. So from my understanding, the Sbdms use the REAP or Racial Equity Analysis Protocol to look over policies, and the teachers are supposed to use the R tool or Affirming Racial Equity for lesson planning. And if y'all have not looked into this R tool, it's like this. I would just encourage all of you to look into it because the link for the teacher's reference is, I would just encourage everybody to look into it. Sorry. So I don't believe it should be this hard for parents to find out what exactly is being taught to our kids. It's also alarming to see page after page of references to theories as well as professional development sessions with a clear narrative for the same theoretical ideologies. If this is the plan, then yes, the transparency is there. But that brings another question. When were the parents going to be notified that this was the direction being taken? It seems school boards are not considering what parents want for their children, nor respecting that we are the parents and should get to decide how some conversations of today's world should be had. I do want a sound and solid education for my children in reading, writing, mathematics, science, music, arts, and history. And I'm not here to speak against history or its ugly truths. I'm also not here to speak against the public school system, as I fully support the public schools. I am here to speak against the indoctrination of my children with theories and ideologies. I want to know that I, as a parent, have somewhat of a say-so what happens behind closed doors when my kids leave for those 6 to 8 hours. I can say this, if the lack of communication continues, many families will find alternatives, such as moving out of districts, private education, homeschooling, and the extreme of moving states. These are all options I know some families are choosing, and I myself have actually considered for this upcoming school year. I did address the school board with a similar presentation and concerns, along with the other parents there. And I believe we were all made to feel as though they had zero concerns for what any of us were saying. It was kind of a, okay, we'll give you 3 minutes to vent, but we're not really going to listen. So that's why I'm here today. For every one of me, there's thousands more parents across the state that have the same concerns. And our ones are simple. We want transparency. We want school boards to remember we are the parents, and we want our children educated, not indoctrinated. Thank you. Sorry for being.
You're fine. Thank you, Ms. Stovall. Appreciate your testimony this morning. Ms. Cahagan, you mentioned that you had conversations with your daughter's teacher, very civil conversations. Were you directed to go to site-based decision-making councils? What and the steps that you took besides just talking to the teacher? What else did you take?
Oh, okay. I opened the line of communication with her very early on through email. Actually, I had a son at the time who was a senior in high school and had emailed his teacher first because he was discussing intersectionality in his senior English class for 2 weeks. So it was just a back and forth email. And like I said, I was a teacher, so whenever and I've always told my kids this, whenever I am looking at a situation between my child and the teacher, I assume the teacher's right. It just kind of, my kids were at that disadvantage, I guess. But so I always approach it from the perspective of, okay, we're going to get things done. But we just continued to communicate all throughout the year. Her teacher and I communicated, and like I said, we were always very polite and respectful, and she was, very good to my daughter. But again, we never got around to those classics that were part of the standards as well, and it was just.
Were you ever notified or publicized about curriculum by site-based decision-making councils? Was that ever presented to you in any material as parents of the school district?
No.
Do you feel that the breakdown is between the curriculum with site-based authority and approving of curriculum without parent input and transparency?
I have to tell you that this past year has been a very big learning experience for me, and I don't know where the breakdown is. I'm not an expert on site-based decision-making committees. I understand that there are 2 parent representatives and then 3 school representatives. So to say that parents are underrepresented in site-based decision-making committees, I think would be fair. I also think it would be fair to say that the transparency is not there because decisions are made in those committees that, like Miranda was saying, where are those? I mean, I know you can go and ask for the minutes, but she did, and I read her minutes, and there's nothing in there to say what curriculum was being used. And I know, like, for instance, this packet that my daughter was given was used widely across our district in other freshman English classes. So did every site-based decision-making committee agree with or, approve that, or is that, and not every freshman English class used it. So I understand there's standards that come from the state, and so they can just use things to teach the different standards. But
Thank you. We've got a couple members with questions. Representative Bojanowski.
Yes, I'll be very brief. Both speakers mentioned indoctrination, and I would like to say, just from a quick Google, indoctrination is the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. And I would like to say on behalf of all educators across the state that one of the most important things that we want our students to do is to engage in critical thinking. So I push back against that phrase being used as an educator, and it troubles me when that statement is used, because critical thinking is, when we had a committee meeting last week with the American Manufacturers Group, one of the most important characteristics that, the incoming employees are lacking is critical thinking. So, thank you.
Senator Givens.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks for organizing this meeting the way you have. The flow is perfect. We're set up now for this next section, and I'll be brief, but I want to share a quick story because I appreciate the two of you. I presume this is your daughter?
That's my daughter.
Yes. Thank you both for being here. Thanks for the presenter on the screen. Thanks for bringing your concerns to us. The moment for me happened 10, 12 years ago about our priorities, and some in the room have already heard this story multiple times. My colleague Steve Riley, I know, has heard it. About 12 years ago, I was standing in line at a high school basketball game to pay $5 and watch one of my close friends coach a girls' basketball game. And I was struck by the irony of standing in line to pay $5 to watch him coach, and I could get into his high school history class and watch him teach for free. What does that say about where our priorities are? I should be getting into the girls' high school basketball game with about 10 other people that are concerned about the athletics going on that floor for free. And there should be a line of 200 people standing outside his history room door, dying to pay $5 to get in and watch him teach. These are the conversations that we need to be having. They're so critical, and I'm excited that we're finally engaging in discussions about curriculum and the things that shape these young people's lives. To that point, the next presenters are going to be coming up in just a moment. I see some KDE representatives here in the room. I would be really interested if the next group of our presenters cannot answer it. It's perfectly understandable. And KDE may not have an answer at hand, but a follow-up sometime over the course of the next couple of weeks that would help me to understand what are the mechanics or processes in place for parents with concerns about curriculum to go to their local schools, their local school district, and say, these are my concerns. What's your process at the district level for my concerns to be heard? We've got lots of processes in the school systems now. I'll be surprised if we don't have some for curriculum, but I'm curious to know what they are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Givens. And with that, we do have a robust agenda. We appreciate both your testimonies today, but we would like to turn the floor over to the next portion of our presentation on curriculum authority and decision-making, and that being the Office of Education Accountability. We have joining us today Ms. Marcia Seiler, Acting LRC Deputy Director, and also Mr. Brian Jones, Investigative Division Manager, also of OEA. Thank you both for being here this morning. And if you would, just please identify yourselves on the record, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks for having me. My name is Marcia Seiler. I'm the Acting Director at the Office of Education Accountability. And with me, I have Brian Jones, who heads up our investigative branch. I've got the responsibility. It's a bit more dry than what's been presented today. I'm going to walk you through statutes, regulations.
Marcia, I'm not sure if your microphone is on or not.
The green light's on. Maybe
it
I
is.
need it a little
Just
closer.
move it closer.
Okay,
Thank you.
sorry. I'm going to walk you through statutes, regulations, links to documents that you all will find helpful through your discussions of curriculum and selection of instructional materials. I'm going to move through quickly. You all can ask me questions if you want. If there's a section under a statute heading, that may just be the part I'm talking about. You could go to that statute. It could be 10 pages long. I just pulled out sections that I think are relevant. We're going to start with 158-645. And these first two statutes on page 1 came around in 1990 with the Kentucky Education Reform Act. So with KARA, things changed, and we sent decisions down to the local level for local decision making. The first, though, set out the 8 capacities required of students in public education. You can read through those and see there's communication skills, understanding governmental processes, self-knowledge and knowledge of what mental and physical wellness. But those are the 8 capacities required for students. The second one is 158-6451, and that is that says schools shall develop their students' ability to, and then there's a list of 7 ideas that the school must develop their students' abilities to do. And you can see those are basic communication and mathematics skills, apply core concepts from math, science, arts, the humanities, social sciences. Section 2 of that statute says KBE shall disseminate to local school districts and schools a model curriculum framework, which is directly tied to these goals, outcomes, and assessment strategies in the statutes. Move down to the middle of page 2, and you can see I've linked you to, on the KDE website, the KDE model curriculum framework that's required by that statute. It's a long document. It's a very interesting document. You'll want to take a look at it. That is what KDE has set out as the curriculum framework. And I think it's on around page 3 to 8. There's a very good description of some topics that you all are talking about, some phrases that have been used. The Kentucky academic standards are referred to as the KAS, and those contain the minimum requirements of what students should know. So when you're talking about standards, that's what they should know at the end of each grade level. The standards address a foundational framework of what is to be learned. Then when you get on to curriculum, the overall purpose of curriculum is to focus on and connect the work of classroom teachers within a school or district to the standards. So that's what's going to happen in the classroom. You take the standards and then they match the curriculum, and that sets up what's going to happen in the classroom during the school year. And then the third part is instructional resources, which is the print, non-print, electronic medium. It's all the documents, the resources that are used within the classroom. That's all set out in the framework, which is online. All right, next, 156-160 provides KDE with the responsibility to promulgate regs establishing the standards. So that's just the statute that gives KDE the responsibility for setting the standards. The next statute, 163-45, is the School-Based Decision-Making Council statute. That is quite a long statute. I've only presented here a few sections, but that's worth reading. As stated earlier, the Sbdm is in each school. So in Kentucky, we have approximately 1,100 schools. There are 800 Sbdms because there are some schools that don't need to have Sbdms. It's all set out in statute. An Sbdm is made up of 2 parents who are elected by parents in the school, 3 teachers elected by the teachers in the school, the principal or another administrator who sits as chair. I'm correct. They're the chair of the committee, yes. And they each serve 1-year term. There's a section in the statute that also says if your school has 8% minority students, then you shall have an election for a minority member. Okay, so just reading through Section 2 of that statute says the school council shall adopt policies to be implemented by the principal, and here are the 11 policies that they must have. And you can see number 1 is determination of curriculum. I highlighted a section as you all were talking. Number 6 says planning and resolution of issues regarding instructional practices. That may be relevant to your discussion of where parents go to talk about instructional issues. I'm not going to read through all these. You all can read them, but just wanted to point out Section G, which I didn't put it in here, but in listening to your discussion, the school council selects instructional materials and text. That's Section G of this statute. Section J talks about the review of data, and I know you all were talking about disaggregation of student data, and so Section J discusses that, disaggregating data by race, gender, disability, and participation in free and reduced lunch. And the school council shall develop a plan to ensure that all students are making progress in meeting goals by those groups. So that's one discussion that the school council has to have. Okay, I'm going to move down a little towards the bottom of page 4. There's training and guidance for Sbdms. So Sbdm councils are required to have training, but they also can get guidance through 2 groups in particular. One, the Department of Education provides links, supports, both through their staff and online to councils. They provide a format, a set school council policy manual that can be used. In addition, the Kentucky Association of School Councils provides training. They assist with developing councils' policies. So those are 2 good links to review. Okay, let's see. KRS 158-6453 is the review of academic standards and assessments. As we discussed, standards are set, and KDE is required beginning in 2017-18 and every 6 years thereafter to implement a process for reviewing Kentucky's academic standards in alignment with assessments. and they are going through that at the end of this section. I'm going to give you the timeline and where they are on that. You can see in the middle of page 5, G1, it says the review process implemented under this subsection shall be open and transparent process that allows all Kentuckians an opportunity to participate. That's written in statute, and I think it's important to review how that's being done. I know transparency is important and found that section to be relevant. When you turn to page 6, I provide the link to the Kentucky standards, and that's the kystandards.org. That is the same page that has the model framework. So that's an important page. You can get the breakdown by grade, by subject. It's very detailed. Right below that, I have the Kentucky Academic Standard Review and Revision Timeline. So based on the statute that requires the standards to be reviewed every 6 years, this is where we are right now. Science is currently in process. Visual and Performing Arts begins in December of 2021. The standards for reading, writing, and math have already been completed, and the reg went into effect March 2019. That means the next review will be 2025 on those standards. Social studies went into effect July 2019, and so 2025 will be the next year for review on those standards. That link's a little long, but that's the link to the review and implementation timeline. Also, an important link is the standards implementation guideline, and that explains how they're reviewed, who's involved, how the committees and panels are set up. It's quite a lengthy document, but I cut out and provided here on page 6 and the top of page 7 3 of the groups that they use in their review. They do advisory panels who are for each content area. They do standards review committees for each content area, and they break it down into grade level. And then there's an overall standards and assessments process review committee that oversees the whole process to make sure that it's being done properly. And you can see who the membership is of that group. Okay. To throw a reg in here, we've got the Kentucky high school graduation requirements, which are set out in 704.3.305. It's 22 credits, and this is a minimum. This is the base. So some schools can give special diplomas and have other requirements, but these are the minimum requirements, 22 credits for graduation. The next statute you all have been discussing today and would be important to review is 158.649, and that sets out the discussion of achievement gaps and how how districts and councils are to utilize gap data in aligning their curriculum and instruction. So I've set out parts of it. It's quite a lengthy process. Page 9, 704.3.540 is the Uniform Academic Course Codes, and KBE manages this document. It's a uniform course code is required to create accurate data so that we can use it to study and analyze. So they've got course codes for every class, and then schools match their courses up to those codes. At OEA, we used it before in past studies, maybe to, I can't remember the exact study, but if we wanted to see what level math classes were being taught in high school, we could pull that course code data and see what the schools were teaching. The last, on page 9, the last section is dual credit courses. A dual credit course is one where the class is a college class and you're getting high school credits. You're getting high school credit for the course, but it's a course that's taught either at the university or college, or it's taught by a teacher that has been approved to teach that course and can give college credit. You can see there's a few ways that 1, 2, 3 there. We have 3 ways to do it. We can do it online. It can be taught by qualified and credentialed teachers and faculty, or it can be offered outside of the secondary school day. And last, on page 10, and I didn't provide a summary for each one, these are the ones that I could find. I don't know if there are any more, but these are examples of the legislature requiring certain curriculum that's outside of the standards. So just a few: voter registration and election procedures, workplace ethics instruction, requiring a passing grade on a civics test, skin cancer, human sexuality, and then the teaching of the Holocaust and genocide. Those are just examples of separate statutes that have been put into effect that are required curriculum in schools. So that was fast.
Marcia, appreciate the overview. I know we have a few questions. We still have a presentation after this, so I'm going to jump right into the questions. Representative Tipton.
Thank you, Chairman Wise. I appreciate you being here today. It's a whole lot to take in, so you have left us some homework for after we leave. But specifically on 16345, as it talks about the school-based decision-making councils. And this has been a question that's come up a lot. So just to clarify, and I know we've brought this up before, but school boards have no authority in curriculum decisions in the state of Kentucky. Is that an accurate statement?
If a school has a site-based decision-making council, then the site-based decision-making council makes the decisions regarding curriculum in that school. Okay. I am unsure if a school is not meeting goals or failing, or there's other reasons why a school board may step in to assist. There may be examples there where they would help. I know that school boards provide curriculum and other assistance at the district level, maybe to help somebody with developing a curriculum for a class, but ultimately the decision lies with the school council.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, could I follow up with another question, please, real quickly?
Briefly, thank you.
It talks about the school council will make these decisions. I bring this question up because of the testimony by some parents previously.
Right.
Is there anything that reflects that these type of decisions have to be recorded or reflected in the minutes of those council meetings and made transparent? Is there anything in there that would specifically say that those decisions have to be within the minutes of the council and have to be provided in a public place like on a website for parents and other stakeholders to view?
I'm not sure my mic. Representative, all committees are public bodies under the Open Record, Open Meeting Law, and so they should be accessible to the public at a convenient time to meet, in a convenient place to meet to accommodate the crowd, and also they're supposed to have minutes. So that's the best answer I can give you. I don't know if there's anything specifically that says this curriculum has to be posted somewhere to be read, but they are subject to open meetings and open records. So if there's a big discussion about curriculum, you would think that would be reflected in minutes.
Yeah. And Mr. Chair, if you could indulge me for one quick question.
30 seconds.
In the training, is there anything specific, because you've got parents on here maybe don't have experience in curriculum, in the training, are they offered training on curriculum development and best practices?
Yes, I can, in review of those on page where I mentioned the page 4, middle of the page, there's 2 links there. KASC and the KDE page regarding Sbdm has lots of material. A lot of it is on curriculum development. It's on other responsibilities of the council, but there is quite a bit on that. And they are required, and I don't have it in front of me, but they are required so many hours a year training when they become a member. So, yes.
Representative Banta.
I just want to I want to say that everything is pretty much laid out, what's supposed to be taught, and boards set policies. So site bases kind of have to go with what the boards want, I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive. I don't know if you can address that or not, and the one thing I would want to remind everybody of is that school board is an elected body, and many, many times school board members are elected over and over and over without any opposition. And this kind of goes back to Senator Givens saying, I'm paying $5 to get in to watch basketball, I should be standing in line to watch a class being taught. You know, when as an old principal, when I went to hire a coach, I had more people telling me what to do than I can ever imagine. But if you go to hire a teacher or you go to elect a school board member, it's crickets. So I just want to remind people that that's an elected body too. And if you had any comments about I just don't think site-based and the board is mutually exclusive. I think they're supposed to work together.
Marcia?
I don't know that I have.
Hey,
I can
you don't have to
opine
answer.
on that thing.
I'm going to move on to the next question. Representative Decker.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you for your presentation. One statute that I didn't hear you talk about and I don't see it is KRS 156.445. And that statute, by the way, it's just a little background. I was elected 9 times to be a parent representative on my children's site-based councils. So I'm familiar with these laws on this. And one of the things that you didn't talk about, and I'd like for you to comment on, is that section 156.445. It talks about the fact that no textbook or program shall be used in any public school in Kentucky as a basal text title unless it has been recommended and listed on the state multiple list by the State Textbook Commission. And it goes on to say that if you use something outside, or if the site-based councils, if you want to adopt something that's not on the textbook list, you're supposed to have your superintendent present that and make sure it's with the standards. So can you comment on that and these books that we're hearing about? Where can we see the state textbook list, and how does that fit into all of this?
That's a good question. That headed down into the weeds of the instructional resources part, and I did not put that in. I was heading with the curriculum, but I can get you that information.
My point,
where the list is.
The question really is these books that are being used and these programs that are being introduced, if they're not on the list, they are in violation of this statute. Is that correct?
I would have to talk to somebody at KDE about that. That's a KDE responsibility.
We could
I don't
follow up
know.
with that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Joining us online remotely, Representative Gibbons Prunty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. My question is related on page 7, the achievement gaps. I know that's a statute and it would have to be changed in statute, but do you have an opinion or any feedback from the ranks as far as, in light of Mr. Rowe's testimony earlier today, if you heard that he feels like that focusing on those is, we should be focusing on the bigger picture, do you have any feedback on that, opinion or otherwise?
I don't. I'm sorry. I appreciate the question, but I can't voice an opinion on statute. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Southworth.
Thank you, and I appreciate our nonpartisan staff at LRC. And I actually am thinking about how do we get that into the classroom. But my question wasn't actually about that. My question was, when we're talking about these one-off print-offs, sheets of paper, packets about like this being used as curriculum, and it's been going on since I was in school. We barely pulled the textbooks off the shelf, and at this point I don't think we have textbooks hardly at all. Is this school-based decision council curriculum in the statute that Representative Decker just mentioned sounded like it was heading toward kind of the officialese of curriculum choices, maybe not like one print-off. So is there any delineation anywhere that says, well, the Sbdm would have to approve a textbook, but they wouldn't have to approve a 30-page print-off, or any kind of threshold so that things that are passing past our children's eyes are or are not being reviewed after they cross a certain threshold? And I'm assuming it's up to the teacher to print off. I mean, we can print off 200 sheets of paper. At this point, it's all digital anyway. that brings me to AI, but I'm not even going there because the question is just to what's the threshold?
I don't know. Brian can help me also.
The council approves curriculum, but there's also a part of the school-based decision-making statute that says that they select textbooks and instructional materials. So that should be broad enough to encompass things other than just the textbooks from the shelf. That's
So-
in 16345. I think it's 2G.
2G.
somewhere.
So if they have to adopt the policy, their policy could potentially be what the threshold is. Is that a possible interpretation?
It could be, and I got into this a little bit trying to figure out how deep they do go, and it actually varies by school, by district, by classroom, probably by grade. They may be more prescriptive in the lower grades and give more flexibility to teachers in higher grades. They may be prescriptive across the board. I think it's school by school.
Is that like a spreadsheetable thing that you have, or
No.
how do we get that type of information?
I don't think, and KDE may be able to answer that curriculum and instructional materials by the school level are collected at any higher level than the school.
Thank you.
Marcia, real quickly, Senator Gibbons, sorry.
Thanks. A quick clarification for me, and thanks for the presentation and the nonpartisan work you do in helping us navigate this question. You referenced something not in our notes, and it was appropriate, it was not, but you referenced 160-345 2G.
Yes, I apologize.
Read that again for all of us, please.
I will. I don't know how I missed the cut and paste. I meant to have that in here. Okay, so specifically it's 160-345 subsection 2G, and it says, the school council shall determine which textbooks, instructional materials, and student support services shall be provided in the school. Subject to available resources, the local board shall allocate an appropriation to each school that is adequate to meet the school's needs related to instructional materials and school-based student support services as determined by the school council. The school council shall consult with the school media librarian on the maintenance of the library media center and the purchase of instructional materials, information technology, and equipment.
Thank you. Marcia, thank you for being here. Brian, thank you also. Appreciate your work with nonpartisan staff and bringing us all the information today for today's meeting. Next on the agenda, and the last thing we have is the Kentucky Science Center. That's right. We have presenters today with us on behalf of the Kentucky Science Center, especially given this past year, the work that they've done to navigate with the coronavirus and COVID-19 as it relates to presentations that took place. And Laura, I don't know if you wish to go first. You said 15 minutes, and I am, as a conductor, got it right on the train's time right now. So
I'm an English teacher, so that's the other side of the brain than counting those minutes, but we can do it. So for the record, I'm Laura Owens, Senior Partner for JYB3 Group.
Melissa Blankenship, Director of Education, Kentucky Science Center.
Sure. Hello, I'm Mike Norman, Chief Executive Officer, Kentucky Science.
Hello, Amy Foster Parrish, Communications Manager, Kentucky Science Center.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for being here today. Please proceed.
Chairman Wise, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to bring these folks from the Kentucky Science Center. During my tenure as Secretary of Education, well more than a decade ago, I became familiar with this organization and the good work they did, and recently have become familiar with them again and recognize the great work that they do. So with that, we will turn it over to our Executive Director to tell you just a little bit about what the Kentucky Science Center is doing actually in most all of your all's counties. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and I appreciate your support, your kind words, and Chairman Wise and Chairwoman Huff, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and join you today. It's truly a privilege, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here to share the story of your Kentucky Science Center. As Laura said, my name is Mike Norman. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Kentucky Science Center. And while I've been with the Science Center for over 10 years now, I've been CEO for about a year and a half. I stepped into the role on March 1st, 2020. As a lifelong Kentuckian, I'm privileged, I'm honored to lead this organization as we promote science literacy and lifelong learning throughout the Commonwealth. So you ask yourself, well, what is Kentucky Science Center? I think if you ask that question in most of the state, you'd hear that Kentucky Science Center is a place to go and do science in fun, engaging, entertaining, and educational ways. It's a field trip destination for school children or an attraction to explore with the family, for many recreating the fond memories of visits from their own childhood. My goal today is to show you that Kentucky Science Center is so much more than that. It is, in fact, more than just a place, because the work of doing science doesn't stop at our front door. With a mission to promote science literacy and nurture lifelong learning, and a mandate to travel throughout the Commonwealth to accomplish that mission, Kentucky Science Center impacts over 180,000 Kentuckians in all 120 Kentucky counties every year. So let me repeat that. We impact all 120 Kentucky counties. Through a combination of offsite camps and educational programming, through digital learning, memberships, and partnerships with statewide organizations, we work to ensure that quality informal science education is accessible and affordable for every Kentuckian, wherever they may be. So the map on this slide shows you our impact. The blue shaded areas show those areas that we have multiple impact points in that county. So that could be a combination of field trips, offsite programming, members, or visitors to our facility. As you can see, the entire state is shaded with some color, with almost 3/4 being in blue. Again, that's the multiple impact points in that county. As a Kentuckian, it makes me very proud to share this with y'all. And before I speak more about our present, let me tell you a little bit about our past. From our founding as a cabinet of curiosities in the public library system of Kentucky in 1871 to our current 50,000 square foot flagship facility on Louisville's Museum Row, Kentucky Science Center has a rich history in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. We began with little more than an Egyptian mummy and a mineral collection, and 150 years later, we're the largest hands-on science center in the state, serving 325,000 people a year, and again, over half of those are Kentuckians. In 2002, we were honored that the General Assembly named us the State Science Center of Kentucky with a unanimous vote in both the House and the Senate. And the General Assembly support was so appreciated then and continues to be appreciated today. And in 2012, we cemented our statewide focus by changing our name from Louisville Science Center to Kentucky Science Center. So what does it mean for a science center to have a statewide focus? Well, for us at Kentucky Science Center, it means making it possible for educators and programs to travel throughout the Commonwealth. In short, it means we bring the science to you. Our overall outreach efforts are broad, and I know my time here is limited, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about 3 particular types of educational outreach that we do regularly throughout Kentucky. The first is our offsite programming, which includes everything we do outside of the building, whether it's across town or across the state. This summer alone, we've led scientific learning experiences of many of the districts represented here, including Boone, Bullitt, Casey, Greene, Jefferson, and Taylor counties. Whether we're leading a science expo in McCreary County or providing science enrichments at a school in Hardin County, our offsite programs impact 75,000 children each year. The second type of outreach I want to share with you is our digital programming. Digital programming has been part of Kentucky Science Center's regular offerings for years, but 2020 provided the need for us to increase the availability of these program offerings. This includes our Youth Science Summits, which gives teens the chance to interact with and learn from industry professionals. We saw attendance at our 2020 Youth Science Summits skyrocket. This was the first one offered digitally, skyrocket by 300%. Several schools shared with us that the digital model of this popular program made it easier for them to enroll more students, increasing access across the Commonwealth. We also increased digital access to our pulse surgery program that allows 6th through 12th graders to get an insider's view of the operating room during a real-time open heart surgery that is streamed live to their schools. This is an amazing program. It really is a one-of-a-kind experience. The students watch open heart surgery as it's happening, and they interact real-time with the team in the operating room. They have the opportunity to ask questions of the team as well as medical students during the after-surgery wrap-up. Because of this, Pulseless surgery has been bringing medical careers to life for students around the Commonwealth for over a decade, including students in Elliott County just this past summer. The third outreach that I want to tell you about involves partnerships with other organizations, including business and government. This provides an opportunity to leverage our relationships to grow our statewide impact. For example, thanks to our partnership with the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives, we've been able to share Science and Play to Go, the mobile version of our next generation early childhood learning experience. At no cost to libraries or the patrons, we provide our mobile version for a 3-month stay at libraries across the Commonwealth. Over the past 5 years, we've been to 14 counties, including Laurel, Marshall, Woodford, and Warren. Serving over 150,000 visitors to date, Science and Play to Go empowers children and adults to learn together through play. And we hire locally, so that when we move our experience on to the next library, the community's capacity for providing early childhood learning experiences has grown. We also have programmatic partnerships with the business community across the Commonwealth. These are integral to our work, helping to expose our audience to a wide array of careers in science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, STEAM that you hear so often. Not only do these programs give companies direct access to a pipeline of students who will become the workforce of tomorrow, they also demonstrate to students the variety of careers and opportunities available in their communities, encouraging them to keep their talents local. All these educational endeavors help us show that science matters, especially for creating educated workers with a mastery of STEAM subjects and skills who are prepared to seize the opportunities and face the challenges of the 21st century. They also enable Kentucky Science Center to advance the idea of science for all, making the crucial workforce development skills of tomorrow accessible to every Kentuckian, wherever they may be. Again, thank you for the honor of addressing this committee today. Thank you to each and every one of you for your service on this critical committee and for the public service each of you provide our Commonwealth. I look forward to working with you so we can best meet your constituents' needs regarding informal science programming, workforce development, and STEAM learning. And if you'd like to see our educators in action, we'll be happy to connect with you next time we're in your districts. So thank you so much, Chairman.
Thank you, Mike. Anyone else, any other comments at the table? Just want to first thank you. I know the work you all do is not just for elementary K through 12, but it's also lifelong learners and everything that the Kentucky Science Center does. And like you mentioned there, of educating us for the workforce and just for the betterment of the Commonwealth. Thank you for all that you do for education across the Commonwealth. We greatly appreciate you all being here.
Thank you.
Also, Representative Bojanowski. Thank you.
Just very briefly. So as a teacher, I've been on multiple field trips to the Science Center, and they're always a blast. And what's so great about it is that it kind of tricks kids into learning without them even thinking they're learning. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Any other comments? Seeing none. Thank you all so much for being here this morning.
Thank you so much.
We do have an administrative regulation review that I do need to do before we leave here today. I also want to say that there was a group on a guest list that did sign up to speak today, representing a group called AFA. Due to the uncertainty of the meeting going right until 1 o'clock, we have a transportation committee meeting that's meeting at 1. Several of our members, including myself, will be attending that meeting. I'm more than happy for these 3 people to meet individually with you all to hear your concerns. But at this time, we're going to stick with what was on the agenda and not allow any public comments at this time. On to the Administrative Regulation Review. It's 703 KAR 005.280. The amendments to this regulation were recently heard by the Education Assessment and Accountability Review Subcommittee and were subsequently referred to our committee. KDA representatives are here to answer any questions that they may have on these proposed amendments. If we have any questions, we have Todd here with us today. Any members, any questions on the reg? Seeing some, we do not need a vote to accept, but these will be moved on from here. Todd, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you always. Is there a motion for an adjournment? Perfect. Thank you all so much.